What is the ketogenic diet and what is the history there?
So the ketogenic diet has been around for around 200 years, and this is a diet where most well known for its to lower carbohydrates in the diet. Lowering carbohydrates in the diet shifts the body away from sugar and carbohydrate dominance as a form of fuel for the body towards more fat and ketogenic or ketone related fuels. That's the kind of main switch between these two forms of diets, and that's how most people can appreciate them. Now, when people think about these diets, they're typically composed of some form of protein. You can think salmon, eggs, chicken, um, dairy can be included on this, nuts can be included on this, with some type of fibrous vegetable, typically consuming less than 50 net grams of carbohydrates per day. And that means total amount of carbohydrates minus fiber. And then you have fat making up the remaining more form of calories. So this typically breaks down to around less than 10% of total calories coming from carbohydrates in the form of green leafy vegetables, around 20 to 25% coming from protein, and the remaining calories making up from fat. And obviously, you can shift these around in any particular fashion someone chooses to, but that's what mostly makes up the diet. Now, I mentioned that this diet has been around for 100 years, or sorry, for over 200 years, but it was originally cited in 1796 by John Rollo as a physician who used this nutritional strategy, a nutritional strategy of very low carbohydrate, as a tool to medicinally treat patients with type 2 diabetes. In fact, it was standard of care for type 2 and type 1 diabetes for 200 years, or going back 200 years. It was known since 1920, so over 100 years, that it was utilized for neurological disorders. It's been known for 150 years that it's been utilized in Banting, where it was a gravedigger who reported his ability to utilize this diet to address obesity. So it's really been around for quite a long period of time as a therapeutic medicinal tool to address some of the most common forms of metabolic dysfunction observed in the developing world, including obesity, multiple forms of diabetes, as well as the emergence of neurological-based conditions. And now, more recently, it has been utilized in a number of emergent trials looking at even things such as anxiety as a mental health condition, bipolar, schizophrenia, and initial pilot analysis and observational studies show it can be quite promising for these conditions. But now there's actually randomized controlled trials and meta-analysis out of JAMA Psychiatry showing its ability to be utilized as a tool to assist in helping treat anxiety as a mental health condition. So it's depression as a mental health condition. So it's a very promising and emerging tool as a medicinal tool, and has a lot of therapeutic promise.
Okay, with this long history, different benefits that you've named, why in modern day society is it still so controversial?
So in the 1970s, the dietary guidelines first came out, and these were issued by the US Senate. And the goal of these were to develop the idealistic diet for the American people. And when they did, they developed a diet that was focused predominantly around higher carbohydrate intake with lower fat. Now, the question is, why would they do this? Well, there was emergent evidence that fat may be of concern because it can raise certain blood lipid levels, in this case, LDL cholesterol, which had been starting to emerge as in a link between that and cardiovascular disease. And obviously, at this time, there was a more rudimentary reductionist mindset towards, okay, if you consume more fat, you will get fatter. If you consume fat, you will displace fat in various tissues. And obviously, it's more calorically dense. For every gram of fat, there's 9 calories, and for every gram of carbohydrates, there's 4 calories. And so there was a shift towards this logical approach of reducing fat. This should, in theory, at this time, improve blood lipid levels. It should also assist in lowering calories in the diet. And this was thought to be healthy because typically the carbohydrates they were recommending at this time were vegetable-based carbohydrates, not typically what eventually emerged in due time. So as this became the predominant diet, and over time, obviously fat had been getting a worse and worse rap as the emergence that higher fat diets were associated with worse and worse outcomes. What was not being addressed is a particular nuance in that conversation. And that, yes, if you eat very high carbohydrate diets and include high fat on top of that, it develops something called the Western diet or the standard American diet, which is an obesogenic diet, which is known to associate with overconsumption, driving obesity, insulin resistance, and most of the major metabolic issues that we observe in the United States and many of the Western developed world. Now, one difference between just a higher fat diet on top of high carbohydrates versus a high fat, very low carbohydrate diet is a very distinct metabolic phenotype where that a very low carbohydrate and very high fat diet, known as the ketogenic diet, has been known to have powerful metabolic changes. Again, where you're switching from carbohydrate and sugar dominance towards a fat based metabolism through metabolic changes in glucose and insulin, which drives this whole shift in the body towards fat and glucose or ketone based metabolism. That shift is quite critical and associated with many metabolic benefits. However, just the elevation of fat on top of an already high carbohydrate based diet has been associated with many negative consequences. So, for a long time, there was this misconception mixing just higher fat diets on top of high carb diets with this other form of diet, which was a low carbohydrate, high fat diet, which is a distinct metabolic difference. And that misnomer or mischaracterization of these two completely different diets as one and the same led to a misconception around the ketogenic diet that persisted for multiple decades. On top of that, we've also known that much emergent evidence has risen on the ability to utilize ketogenic diets over long periods of time, of which our group has reported in the context of metabolic diseases, such as type 1 diabetes. And we've shown that over a 10-year longitudinal study, that in type 1 diabetes, that this diet can actually have powerful therapeutic benefits, be sustainable without any major adverse consequences. In fact, it had powerful therapeutic effects on glucose, insulin, and in our particular report, in AJP Cell Physiology, it also showed the ability to have remarkable cardiovascular health in a disease with 10-fold higher cardiovascular risk. So there's a lot of reasons why there was a push for higher carbohydrate intake in the form of more plant-based foods, higher fiber intake, because of all the evidence supporting that that may be beneficial for health. But there was a lot of mischaracterizations and misconceptions around higher fat intake that was mixing two distinct forms of diet, which actually were distinct from one another. And so in many ways, this drove a push away from lower carbohydrate intake. And since the 1970s and these original guidelines, essentially the dietary guidelines have remained remarkably similar all the way up until this last year, where the vast majority of calories come from fruit, grains, vegetables. The remaining come from smaller quantities than protein. And then you're allowed to have up to 10% of your diet from sugar. Now, there's a complete a reversal of this approach, because what has also happened, Jesse, alongside this belief structure that higher carbohydrate diets were superior, in which they are not, they're just one of the many tools in the toolbox that people can utilize on their journey towards health, alongside a ketogenic diet, is that these dietary strategies, such as higher carbohydrate diets or ketogenic diets, have for a very, very long time been pitted as one or the other, or enemies are once amongst one another. When in reality, if done correctly, they can be beneficial for some people, whereas other people may benefit from a different approach. But dietary guidelines have almost exclusively focused on one type of diet. And that's a major problem, because 9 out of 10 individuals in the United States of America, according to multiple studies, have some form of metabolic dysfunction, meaning their waistline is enlarging, their fasting glucose levels are above normal levels, their triglycerides are elevating, or one other metabolic biomarker has categorized 9 out of 10 adults in the United States of America across multiple studies to have suboptimal metabolic health. So when people utilize these high carbohydrate diets since the 1970s as the one optimal form of diet that we should be advising for all Americans, it is foregoing the knowledge for over 200 years that lower carbohydrate ketogenic style strategies are actually one of the most effective ways to reverse things like obesity and diabetes and other major conditions that now plague the vast majority of adults in the United States of America.
Okay, given what you just said there, 9 out of 10 Americans have metabolic syndrome. You're knee deep in the research. Somebody who wants to walk their way out of that, looking just at the science, is the ketogenic diet the best way to do that?
Well, it depends on the person. So this is a very individualized situation. If we were to just look at the evidence at large, and the American Diabetes Association in their 2019 consensus acknowledges this, the most evidence-based way to lose weight, lower blood pressure, reduce HbA1c, which is a 2 to 3 month average of glucose control, is a very low carbohydrate-based diet for diabetes specifically. But if it's optimal, it really depends on the individual person. Every person has different lifestyle, cultural, kids, work, when they can exercise or can't, or maybe they can't exercise at all, the foods they're going to get access to. All these different variables play into whether it's going to be optimal or not for an individual person. Because I can tell you what the optimal diet is, Jesse, but if you can't follow it, it's irrelevant to you, right? So, but if we only focus on the literature, we can see that there is evidence that says that if you were to follow an extremely healthy form of a a low fat diet, high carbohydrate diet, kind of more similar to what would be a vegetarian diet, that yes, that can lower insulin quantities in the blood. And there are some health benefits from shifting from a Western diet to a diet such as a vegetarian diet. A lot of evidence that suggests that. But we also know there's a ton of evidence for over 200 years that shifting towards a lower carbohydrate ketogenic style diet has also profound health benefits alongside it. So when actually looking at the ability to address or even actually put type 2 diabetes into remission, we know that both diets can help assist in this. The most evidence-based of these diets is the low carbohydrate ketogenic style diet, according to the American Diabetes Association. Now, another thing to consider is adherence. So one of the struggles that many people find on their journey to, let's say, reduce their body fat, reduce their glucose levels or insulin levels in their blood, maybe assist with their diabetes management or reversing it altogether, is the ability to sustain the dietary approach that is most likely to help them achieve that goal. And in the context of something like obesity and type 2 diabetes, weight loss is incredibly important. Well, how are you going to lose weight? You have to change your diet. Now, what is one of the main reasons someone fails, Jesse, to actually adhere to a diet and see weight loss over time? Hunger. And so that's the emergence of GLP-1 receptor agonists, semaglutide, Ozempic, Wegovy, tirzepatide, all these various weight loss drugs. And what they primarily do is elevate GLP-1 in the brain, leading to a dramatic reduction in hunger, which allow people to adhere to much lower calorie diets of any form. So people lose weight. Okay. But how do you do that without these various tools? Well, you have to find a diet that allows you to not feel as hungry. Well, one of the most well-known forms of food in the American diet that often drives hunger with low nutritional value is refined carbohydrates. In fact, if you look at the grocery store, typically the 70% in the center of the grocery store is this processed, sometimes ultra-processed forms of carbohydrates, which often are either reduced or absent in nutrient quality and have obviously an abundance in caloric density because these diet or people often overconsume these styles of foods. They're actually very prevalent, make up a huge percentage of many American diets. So simply removing those as barriers allow people to often volitionally reduce their caloric intake, which is why so many people, including multiple bodies of evidence, suggest that when people just reduce these forms of carbohydrates in the diet, they reduce their struggle with reducing the calories required to reduce body weight. So it's one of many tools in the toolbox. Is it superior than others? Well, in type 2 diabetes, it appears that it might be for at least weight loss, HbA1c or glucose control and blood pressure. But everyone's going to find what works best for them, because if you lost even more weight on a different diet, then I would say that's best for you. So it comes down to the person.
Since you made it to the end of this clip, I know you're going to love the full episode. Click here to watch. I'll see you over there.
A very low carbohydrate and very high fat diet known as the ketogenic diet has been known to have powerful metabolic changes. When people utilize these high carbohydrate diets since the 1970s as the one optimal form of diet, it is